In this critique, we examine a dark fantasy submission where a captured alchemist named Helena Marino relies on the extreme pain of electric shocks to measure time while trapped in total sensory deprivation, only to awaken to a world where her mind has been physically altered to hide devastating secrets. Let's look closely at the section discussing the 10,800-second interval between those shocks.
Right, the time she spends just waiting in the inertia tank.
Yeah, because the text paints this sensory deprivation tank as like a featureless, pitch-black ocean. And in that endless, silent dark, the body itself really becomes a cage.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when you strip away all sight, all sound, all temperature variation, the brain desperately searches for, well, any input. And here, that violent, terrifying jolt of electricity becomes a lighthouse. It acts as an absolute focal point.
The psychological anchor of the 10,800-second shock interval is an incredibly brilliant survival mechanism for sensory deprivation, but the narrative completely misses the chance to dig into the terrifying cognitive decay happening between those anchor points.
So you think it glosses over the actual experience of it?
Yeah, I mean, the setup is clearly established in those opening pages. We understand the mechanics of her counting, but look at how quickly the narrative rushes past the visceral experience of that mental deterioration.
Right, it establishes that she counts the seconds, one by one, up to 10,800 just to measure these 3-hour gaps.
Exactly. And then it simply states that she stops counting out of fear of the sheer volume of time passing.
Yeah, it almost reads like, a logbook entry rather than a moment of profound psychological trauma.
And that's the core weakness here. The transition out of the tank and into her awakening sequence happens entirely too cleanly. By moving so rapidly out of the water, the text really blunts the horror of her dissociation.
Because it ignores the slippage.
Right. It glosses over the psychological slippage that inevitably occurs when a human mind is trapped in the dark like that. We are talking about a scenario where a mind becomes so completely starved for stimulation that it begins to cannibalize itself.
Wow, yeah.
It begins to actually crave its own torture just to prove it still exists. By summarizing this period, rather than letting the reader sit in the suffocating weight of it, the narrative loses so much tension.
I hear that, but doesn't dwelling on that decay run the risk of dragging out the pacing? I mean, if she is just floating in the dark, losing her mind over thousands of seconds, how do we keep the momentum going without boring the reader?
That is a completely valid concern regarding momentum, but the tension isn't about the literal passing of time on the page.
Right, it's not just a clock ticking.
Exactly. It is about the friction of her anticipation. The suggestion here is to heavily emphasize the agonizing anticipation and the gradual, terrifying warping of Helena's perception of time between those shocks.
Okay, so we lean into the weight.
Yes. We need to make the pain a coveted lifeline rather than just a passive event that periodically happens to her. The horror shouldn't simply be that she is being tortured. The true dark fantasy horror is that she is being driven to a point where she desperately wants to be shocked.
Oh, so it's less about the clock and more about that psychological friction. It is almost like, well, like holding your breath underwater.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it.
The tension isn't the water itself, right? The tension is your lungs burning, demanding oxygen, even if that oxygen is somehow painful.
Yes, exactly. Let's think about how to actually execute that tension on the page. For a concrete example, try showing Helena's internal monologue beginning to subconsciously anticipate the shock as that 10,800th second approaches.
Like a twisted kind of excitement?
Right. You could portray a deeply twisted, shameful sense of relief washing over her when the agony finally arrives. Let the reader feel the electricity searing through her neck and the violent muscle spasms.
But frame those physical sensations as like the only vibrant color in a world of endless, suffocating gray.
Exactly.
That makes the pain the reward. It is a total, terrifying inversion of a survival instinct.
And to push that even further, describe her absolute panic when she inevitably loses count. Instead of her just rationally deciding to stop counting, show her forcing her mind to rely on the fading physical echo of the last muscle spasm.
Oh man, just clinging to the pain.
Yeah, have her chase the ghost of that pain, trying to flex a muscle that was just electrocuted just to prove her physical body hasn't actually dissolved into the water. Let the reader experience the friction of her rational mind trying to hold on to logic while her primal brain begs for the lightning.
which makes her eventual extraction from that tank so much more jarring. Because once she is pulled out of that pitch-black ocean, we immediately transition to the external threats she faces upon awakening.
Right, the interrogation room.
Yeah, and the material makes a strong case for the varying degrees of villainy by highlighting the different brands of terror represented by her captors. On one side, we have Dr. Stroud.
The clinical one.
Exactly. She is characterized by the sterile, completely academic curiosity. She treats Helena's profoundly violated mind like an interesting anomaly on a spreadsheet.
Yeah, totally detached.
And then on the other side, we have Mondel, the overseer who originally threw Helena into the tank out of spite and jealousy. It is a fascinating dichotomy. We are looking at clinical horror right next to passionate, sadistic torture.
Contrasting Dr. Stroud's chillingly detached clinical horror with Mondel's passionate, sadistic torture creates a really compelling dynamic. But Mondel's cartoonish groveling totally undermines the sophisticated terror she initially represents.
Yeah. Her reaction to the Supreme Necromancer is, well, it's intense.
Think about how Mandel is established early on. She is a brutal, calculated tormentor. Leaving Helena fully conscious in a sensory deprivation tank is an act of profound, deliberate cruelty.
Right.
Yet the moment she is brought before Morrow, her immediate, pathetic begging completely dilutes the psychological dread she is supposed to evoke.
She literally throws herself on the floor weeping and blames petty jealousy for her actions. She acts like a child caught stealing candy, not this terrifying, sadistic interrogator.
And that rapid reduction of Mandel to a groveling, panicked subordinate is a significant weakness. It strips her of her agency and turns her into a highly generic villain.
So when she gets killed, it just doesn't hit as hard.
Exactly. When Mora grips her chest OP and extracts the limitidium, it is undoubtedly a gruesome scene. But because Mandel has already been reduced to a pathetic, weeping state, her violent death and subsequent reanimation feel closer to white noise horror.
Let's unpack that term a bit. White noise horror meaning, like, it is just volume for the sake of volume? Blood for the sake of blood?
Yes, it becomes an exercise in excessive gore rather than a calculated, emotionally resonant narrative payoff. We lose the psychological weight of the execution because we no longer respect the victim as a threat.
That makes sense.
Meanwhile, Stroud's cold, bureaucratic efficiency standing in that very same room feels far more grounded and consequently far more terrifying.
I understand the contrast you are pointing out, but let me push back on this a little. I mean, wouldn't anyone grovel before a supreme necromancer who literally has the power to rip people's chests open with a thought?
Sure, it's terrifying.
If we make Mandel totally unrepentant, don't we risk making her seem incredibly stupid? It is basic human nature to panic and beg when a literal god of death turns their wrath on you.
That is a fair observation regarding human nature, but we have to consider what serves the story's atmosphere best. The suggestion here is to elevate Mandel's cruelty by having her maintain a twisted conviction in her actions, even when confronted by her terrifying superior.
Oh, so she stands her ground.
Right. Stupidity and fanaticism often look similar, but fanaticism is much scarier to read. She needs to own her sadism. If she holds her ground, she becomes a much more complex foil to Stroud's clinical detachment.
I see.
That, in turn, maintains the psychological tension of the scene rather than letting it devolve into a predictable slasher movie dynamic.
So we replace cowardice with a horrifying sense of self-righteousness?
Exactly. Let's visualize how this could play out as a concrete example. Instead of prostrating herself and blaming mere professional jealousy, Mandel could frame her torture of Helena as a necessary experimental purification.
Oh, wow.
She could look Morrow directly in those empty, burning eye sockets and argue that leaving a Vitamancy conscious in the tank was a twisted interpretation of loyalty to the regime. She could claim it was a necessary methodology to break the spirit of the resistance before breaking the physical body.
Oh, that is infinitely darker. She isn't apologizing. She is literally trying to sell her torture methods to the boss.
And when Morrow rejects this ideology and tears her open anyway, it highlights his unfathomable power and cruelty without making Mandel look weak. It shows that in this hierarchy, even the most devoted sadists are entirely disposable.
Right, it elevates Morrow without diminishing Mandel.
Yes. Additionally, to heighten Stroud's contrasting brand of terror, have Stroud observe Mandel's bloody execution with mere clinical disdain rather than shock.
Like she's just annoyed by the mess?
That in this world, bureaucratic apathy is far more dangerous and far more common than passionate sadism.
It is the ultimate expression of the banality of evil. Stroud doesn't care that a woman is being torn apart inches away from her. She only cares that her data is being compromised.
Right.
It creates an incredibly bleak environment for Helena. She is surrounded by monsters, but the monsters wear lab coats and take meticulous notes.
Which, brings us to the core of Stroud's work.
The Vitamancy. Yeah? Okay, so what I really like about this part is the magic system. The concept that trauma and memories are blocked not by a simple amnesia spell, but by physically rerouting the brain's pathways.
It's very grounded.
Dr. Stroud describes it as a city with rerouted streets. It is a brilliant, highly visual concept. But I have to ask, does having the villain explain the magic system via a metaphor run the risk of making the experience feel, too mechanical?
The literal transmutation of the mind as a physical barricade against trauma is a profoundly original magic system, though its presentation currently leans way too heavily on exposition from the antagonists, rather than Helena's lived, disorienting experience.
Right, because Stroud is the one telling us how it works.
Think about how we currently learn about this mind-altering transmutation. It happens primarily through Dr. Stroud standing over Helena, reading a resonance screen, analyzing the pathways aloud, and explaining it to the room.
It feels a bit like sitting in a doctor's office while they read an MRI report to a medical student, rather than experiencing the migraine yourself.
That external delivery is a massive weakness. It distances the reader from Helena's internal dissociation. It risks reducing a deeply psychological, intimate concept, the forced, non-consensual alteration of a human soul and memory, to mere medical jargon.
Yeah, it kind of stops the scene dead.
When Stroud stops the scene to explain how Vitamancy works on the physical architecture of the brain, it completely stalls the narrative pacing. More importantly, it severely blunts the emotional impact of what Helena has actually lost.
Because we're just hearing about it.
Right, we are being told the streets in her mind are rerouted, but we are not walking down those streets and hitting the dead ends alongside her.
But if we don't have Stroud explain the streets and the rerouting, won't the reader just be completely lost? I mean, we need the audience to understand the rules of this transmutation so the magic system doesn't just feel like a random hallucination.
Absolutely.
The city streets metaphor clarifies the mechanical rules of the world.
The rules are absolutely necessary, but sequences everything in narrative structure. The suggestion here is to shift the initial revelation of the mind's transmutation from an external diagnosis to Helena's internal cognitive dissonance.
Okay, so we start with Helena.
We need to allow the reader to experience the physical barrier functioning in real time, inside Helena's head, before Stroud explicitly defines it for the audience. The magic system needs to be felt before it is understood.
So the diagnosis should confirm what the reader is already experiencing, rather than introducing it. We need to actually put the reader inside that city Stroud is talking about.
Exactly. For a concrete example of how to achieve that cognitive dissonance on the page, imagine the moment Morrow uses his dark resonance to force memories to the surface.
Right, the interrogation sequence.
Do not just say Helena remembered things, or that her memories were blocked. Describe her thoughts physically hitting a wall. Show her internal monologue being violently diverted down the wrong street in her mind.
Oh, I see. You could show her experiencing a completely benign, warm memory of her partner Luke, like maybe the specific way the sunlight hit his eyes on a Tuesday morning.
Yes, start with the warmth, but then show that benign memory abruptly and confusingly bleeding into the traumatic sensory details of his death.
Oh, brutal.
Introduce the smell of blood or the sound of burning flesh crashing into the quiet morning memory, because the forced rerouting in her brain is malfunctioning under the stress of the interrogation.
So the streets are overlapping.
Right. Let the reader feel the geographical block in her physical brain. Show her reaching for a simple word or a name she knows she should recognize and feeling a literal, phantom physical pressure inside her skull, pushing her thought in a completely different direction.
House. She is walking down a familiar hallway, opens a door she has opened 1,000 times, and suddenly, well, there is just a brick wall there.
and her brain physically aches from the impact of hitting it.
If you let us experience the profound vertigo of that mental architecture shifting before the doctors ever pull out the resonance screens to discuss it, the medical jargon later on becomes horrifying rather than dry.
That makes so much sense.
The exposition just becomes a confirmation of the violation we just witnessed.
It makes the intrusion into her mind so much more violating. It isn't just that she forgot something. It is that someone trespassed into her identity, ripped up the floorboards, and built a wall without her permission.
Exactly.
Well, to quickly recap our main points from this critique. First, we discussed maximizing the horror of the sensory deprivation lifeboat by exploring Helena's psychological decay and her terrifying primal craving for the electric shocks.
Right.
Second, we addressed balancing the clinical versus sadistic villainy by ensuring Mandel maintains her ideological conviction, contrasting sharply with Stroud's chilling bureaucratic apathy.
Yeah, that contrast is key.
And finally, we looked at grounding the incredible mind transmutation magic deeply within the protagonist's internal, disorienting experience, rather than relying strictly on external medical exposition.
To summarize those actionable suggestions, deepen the psychological dependency on the pain in the inertia tank. Do not rush the countdown. Let the anticipation build the dread.
Right.
Second, give Mundell a twisted sense of righteousness when confronting Morvro to elevate the tension and avoid generic gore. And lastly, let Helena internally feel the architectural barriers in her mind. Let her experience the vertigo and the physical blockage of her thoughts before the antagonist explain the science behind it.
Thank you for sharing this material with us. We invite you to implement these strategies and submit your revised work back in for more feedback.